Yesterday, David Grusch, 14 years Air Force intelligence, 21 years holding a top-secret clearance, the man who testified under oath before the United States Congress, sat down and confirmed it, not suggested, not implied, confirmed, that we have recovered craft not made by human beings, that we have recovered the bodies of the extraterrestrial beings who piloted them, that some of those beings were taken alive, that the program hiding all of it has been running uninterrupted for nearly 80 years, and that he knows where to look. The bodies are somewhere. Right now, tonight, that's where we begin. It was August 14th, 2026. One day ago, David Grusch, former Air Force intelligence officer, former National Geospatial Intelligence Agency analyst, holder of a top-secret clearance for 21 consecutive years, sat down with Dr. Phil McGraw for a podcast interview. And he said something, several things actually. But one sentence above all others deserves to be examined with the same precision that Grusch himself was trained to apply to the nation's most sensitive intelligence. He said, "Yes, and I know people who have had direct interactions in a detainment situation. That was in response to a direct question. Have any of these pilots or occupants of these craft been taken alive? Alive, not recovered post-crash, not retrieved from wreckage. Alive, detained, communicated with, through what Grusch described as something resembling telepathy, though he was careful to say he couldn't begin to explain the mechanism. He described cabinet-level officials, former ones, people who, he implied, worked directly under a former vice president he referred to obliquely as Darth Vader. You can decide for yourself who he meant, but before we get to the living ones, we have to talk about the dead ones, because they came first, and the trail they left behind, in documents, in testimony, in the strange and systematic disappearance of records, is the one I've been following. The deeper I went into this, the more I stopped being surprised by what I found. I started being surprised by what I couldn't find. Grusch is not the first. He is, arguably, the most credible institutional voice to go public in the modern era, but he is part of a lineage of insiders that stretches back decades. The accounts converge on a set of stubborn, recurring details. Small beings, large heads, large eyes, greyish skin, recovered from crash sites, autopsied, filed away. In the 1994 aerial school incident in Zimbabwe, 80 school children, 80 children ages 6 through 12, most with no exposure to Western science fiction, described with remarkable uniformity the beings they reported seeing near a landed craft during recess. Large eyes, small mouths, no visible nose to speak of, thin. Child after child, interviewed separately, drew pictures that looked disturbingly similar. Grusch referenced this incident directly. You look at the aerial school event in 1994, where 80 schoolchildren in Zimbabwe saw what we would call in pop culture speak grey, small grey aliens, exactly the way you think. And what do you know? Some of them look exactly as reported by credible observers that have nothing to gain and everything to lose by discussing their experience. 80 children, nothing to gain, everything to lose. The Harvard psychiatrist John Mack spent years interviewing individuals who reported contact experiences. He was a Pulitzer Prize-winning academic, not a fringe figure, not a tabloid contributor. After years of clinical work, he reached a conclusion that reportedly unsettled his colleagues. Something was happening to these people, something real, something that resisted conventional psychological explanation. Grusch cited Mack's work directly in the interview, and here's the strange part. Mack died in 2004, struck by a drunk driver in London. His archives were donated to Harvard. His case files remain in large part inaccessible to independent researchers. The institution that held his work has been, by most accounts, less than cooperative with those trying to build on it. The silence around his legacy is not loud, but it is consistent. What Grusch described in the interview is not a single event, not a single crash, not a single recovery. It is, by his account, a decades-long systematically organised program. A bureaucratic architecture built specifically to manage recovered materials, including biological materials, in a way that insulates it from congressional oversight, presidential awareness, and freedom of information requests. Kind of like the movie Indiana Jones, we've stashed it all over the place, he said. All the big contractors are involved, and the CIA, Office of Naval Intelligence, something called Federally Funded Research and Development Centers. He named a number, between 25 and under 100 recovered craft. Several dozen vehicles over the last 8 or 9 decades, some piloted, some not, some with occupants recovered intact, some without. The ones with occupants are what concern us here, because those occupants, the cadavers as Grusch repeatedly called them, were not simply catalogued and forgotten. They were studied, they were moved, they were, according to his testimony, held at facilities run by a combination of government agencies and private defence contractors. Facilities that exist not on classified government property necessarily, but sometimes within the sprawling, largely unaudited world of defence contracting, where congressional oversight is thinner and freedom of information statutes simply don't apply. This raises a simple but critical question. If you wanted to hide something indefinitely from the American public, from Congress, from the presidency itself, where would you put it? Not in a government building. Too many audits, too many inspectors general, too many career bureaucrats who might one day grow a conscience. You'd put it in private hands, with a security clearance structure so compartmentalized that the left hand genuinely cannot see what the right hand is doing. Where funding comes not from appropriated congressional dollars which require disclosure, but from the net profits of defense contracts that are never examined at that granular a level. Grusch said it plainly. Keeping the funding outside of congressional oversight. So if you're using non-appropriated dollars and you're using a corporation whose net profits are being used to reverse engineer it, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Here is where the investigation becomes genuinely unsettling. Not because of what exists, because of what doesn't. The historical record of American government engagement with the UFO phenomenon begins, officially, in 1947. Project Sign, then Project Grudge. Then the notorious Project Blue Book, which ran until 1969, and officially concluded that no evidence of extraterrestrial craft had been found. Case closed, move along, except. The Robertson Panel of 1953, a CIA-organized scientific committee convened ostensibly to review the Air Force's findings, did something peculiar. It recommended not further study, but active debunking, a systematic effort to reduce public interest in the subject, to mock witnesses, to deploy ridicule as a policy tool. Grusch described the dual nature of this era precisely. The 1953 Robertson panel kind of changed the tone and developed a systematic ridicule process, while the government was seriously taking this very seriously. And what we saw in some of the recent tranches was documents from the early 50s and late 40s showing how serious the Air Force and the Navy were taking this. So, publicly, swamp gas and ball lightning, privately, serious, well-funded investigation. And somewhere in between those two tracks, the public mockery and the private urgency, and the documents begin to go missing. The early UAP-related files at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio have been the subject of researcher inquiries for decades. What researchers consistently find is not denial exactly, it's something stranger. Gaps. Records that were clearly maintained at one point, referenced in other documents, cited in memos that simply no longer exist. Filed under categories that have since been reclassified to the point of inaccessibility. Or destroyed. Grusch drew a direct line between this pattern and MK-Ultra, PAY, the CIA's mid-century mind control and human experimentation program that remained entirely secret until 1975, and then only came partially to light because a small batch of financial records had been stored separately and survived the document purge ordered by CIA Director Richard Helms. I do worry if President Trump hasn't provided a classified or otherwise historical document preservation notice hold that a lot of the information on the UAP recovery program is being destroyed as we speak, akin to MK Ultra in the 70s, Grusch said. He wasn't speaking hypothetically. He was issuing a warning. And that's where MK Ultra becomes impossible to ignore as a structural parallel. Because the lesson of MK Ultra is not just that the government committed atrocities. The lesson is that an apparatus of deliberate multi-generational document destruction can work almost completely. We know perhaps 30% of what MK Ultra involved, Grusch noted. The other 70% burned. What percentage of the UAP recovery record has already burned? Let's talk about facilities, because the bodies have to be somewhere. The term black site in common usage refers to clandestine detention facilities operated by intelligence agencies, officially non-existent, practically very real. But in the context of non-human biological storage, we're likely looking at something different in character if similar in function. Grusch was careful, strategically vague, but he was willing to gesture. He described locations that he knew of up until the point when his sources inside those facilities were no longer providing him active intelligence. He acknowledged the existence of a program protection strategy, a deliberate policy of moving archives and materials when a facility's location is believed to have been compromised. There is a program protection strategy, unfortunately, to move movable archives and materials if they feel like the location has been burned or exposed, he said. He offered one tantalizing directional clue, answering a question about whether he could physically take Dr. Phil to see a craft and a cadaver. Oh yeah, we could take a little field trip out west, we'll say. Out west. This aligns with a body of testimony and investigative reporting, much of it obscure, much of it dismissed, that points to a cluster of facilities in the American Southwest and Mountain West as storage and research sites. Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, Colorado, states with vast uninhabited land, states with existing infrastructure for classified programs, states where a heavily guarded compound can exist for decades without attracting meaningful scrutiny. The Dugway Proving Ground in Utah is one such facility that has attracted sustained investigative attention. Located in the Great Salt Lake Desert, Dugway is enormous, roughly 800,000 acres, and its stated mission involves chemical and biological defense testing. What makes it interesting to UAP researchers is not what's confirmed there, but what's been alleged by peripheral sources over decades that portions of the facility have been used for storage and analysis of recovered materials with no official program attribution. Separate from the listed mission, separate from the budgetary line items that Congress actually sees. Is there anything definitive tying Dugway to recovered alien biological remains? No, there is not. What there is, a pattern of sightings in the surrounding region dating back to the 1950s, a facility with essentially unlimited classified space, and the institutional DNA of an organization that has a documented history of conducting programs its own oversight structures weren't aware of. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across the American West. Then there is the question of contractor facilities. This is, in some ways, the more interesting thread, because government facilities, even the most classified ones, are in theory subject to some form of oversight. Contractor facilities operating under private corporate structures are not. They exist in a regulatory grey zone that was, perhaps not coincidentally, dramatically expanded during the post-9/11 defense spending explosion that Grusch referenced directly. Starting in the early 2000s, when a lot of money was siphoned for the global war on terror, the big defense contractors started doing their own retrieval sort of off books, under the cognizance of certain government agencies. So there's a lot in, I'll call it, private possession in defense contractor space that I think the government doesn't have a full accounting on, he said. The government doesn't have a full accounting. That sentence should be read slowly, twice. The public discourse around recovered non-human bodies tends to orbit a small number of famous incidents. Roswell, 1947. The Kecksburg, Pennsylvania retrieval of 1965. The Rendlesham Forest incident in England in 1980. These are the canonical cases. They exist in the cultural mainstream. They have been debated, dismissed, and re-examined so many times that the signal has become difficult to extract from the noise. So let's go elsewhere. In 1948, a case known in investigative circles as the Aztec, New Mexico recovery, distinct from Roswell, was reported through a series of sources that eventually reached researcher Frank Scully, who published an account in 1950. The Aztec case described a craft approximately 100 feet in diameter that had landed, apparently intact, near the town of Aztec. Inside, according to the account Scully collected, were 16 small bodies, human in general shape but not human in particulars, roughly 3.5 feet tall, with oversized heads and features that multiple described similarly. The bodies were allegedly intact and showed no signs of trauma consistent with a crash. They appeared to have died from rapid decompression or atmospheric incompatibility. The case was subsequently subjected to a systematic debunking campaign that succeeded largely in removing it from serious discussion. Two men, Silas Newton and Leo Gebauer, were prosecuted for fraud in an unrelated oil scheme, and their association with the Aztec story was used to contaminate the entire account by proximity. Were Newton and Gebauer fraudsters? Apparently. Does that mean the underlying account they were adjacent to was fabricated? That's a logical leap the official dismissal never quite earned. The deeper you look at the Aztec case, the more the debunking feels like a debunking of the messengers rather than the message. Then there's the 1974 incident near Coyame, Chihuahua, Mexico, sometimes called the Mexican Roswell. A small civilian aircraft and an unidentified disc-shaped craft appear to have collided, based on radar data and subsequent ground reports. Mexican military personnel allegedly reached the crash site first and recovered wreckage and biological material. According to accounts that circulated in the intelligence community and were eventually discussed by researchers including Noé Torres and Ruben Uriarte in their 2007 book on the incident, a US military retrieval team subsequently crossed the border without authorization under any treaty framework and removed the materials. What happened to the biological material allegedly recovered at Coyame? No official record exists. No congressional hearing has addressed it. The radar data that might corroborate the collision is, per researchers who have attempted to obtain it through official channels, unavailable. Unavailable. That word does a lot of work in this field. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, a series of documents began circulating among researchers, allegedly leaked from within the intelligence apparatus and that described a program called Majestic 12, or MJ-12, supposedly established by presidential directive in 1947 to manage the recovery and study of non-human craft and biological materials. The documents describe procedures for autopsy, preservation and storage of recovered bodies. They described findings, anatomical details, physiological anomalies, the absence of a digestive tract, the presence of what appeared to be an entirely different biological architecture than anything in the terrestrial record. The FBI investigated the MJ-12 documents and declared them fraudulent. The specific determination, the signature of a particular official on one document used a stamp format inconsistent with the period. One stamp, that was the evidence of fraud. And on the basis of that one evidentiary thread, the entire package was dismissed. Not examined document by document, dismissed wholesale. This raises a simple but critical question. If you were managing a genuine program to conceal recovered biological materials and documents from that program leaked, wouldn't the cleanest possible solution be to introduce a single demonstrable flaw a forged or improperly stamped element that would allow the entire package to be formally discredited. I'm not asserting that's what happened. I'm asking why that possibility was apparently never seriously investigated. Grusch described something in the Dr. Phil interview that deserves its own extended examination. He described the mechanism by which information is kept, not just from the public, but from elected officials, from the presidency itself. There were sensitive programs I worked on that we purposely hid from the Director of National Intelligence oversight staff. Stuff we only briefed the White House and kept it away from Congress through a unique shell game of not reporting programs, he said. And further, they're briefed by one thing by CIA in their one hat at the White House, and then when they go to another agency and sit in a briefing for that same program, they're telling another cabinet member a totally different story about what this classified program is doing. Two different stories to two different cabinet members about the same program. The implication is almost baroque in its complexity. A classified program that tells different lies to different authorized recipients in order to prevent any single person from assembling a complete picture. A bureaucratic architecture of deliberate fragmentation. Once you understand that mechanism, the history of presidential statements about UFOs looks different. Presidents who claimed ignorance may have been genuinely ignorant, not because the programs didn't exist, but because the information was deliberately withheld in a way that technically complied with classification rules while practically ensuring continued concealment. Temporary employees, Grusch called them, presidents, cabinet members, political appointees, people who come and go every 4 or 8 years, while the permanent machinery, the career officers, the deep state infrastructure, to use his phrase, maintains continuity across administrations, maintains the secret, tends the flame. Kind of the intelligentsia at deep state that unfortunately, or fortunately, because I learned the ways of the force, so to speak, that I was a part of for years, kept that torch burning and controlled the issue and allowed the political appointees to essentially come and go without many of them knowing. He used the phrase, the ways of the force, a Star Wars reference, said with a kind of rueful familiarity. He was one of them. That's what makes his testimony structurally different from most. He's not an outsider describing something he glimpsed from the perimeter. He's an insider describing something he was trained in, embedded in, and then chose, at significant personal cost, to step away from and expose. Let's return to the cadavers, because we keep circling around them, and that's intentional because that's how the evidence works. You keep coming back, you keep looking, and each time you look there's slightly more detail. Grusch confirmed in the clearest terms he felt able to use given ongoing classification constraints. That audio-visual evidence of recovered cadavers was brought to him, exfiltrated is the word he used, by individuals inside the retrieval program. I had folks from the retrieval program, I'll call it, exfiltrate audio-visual evidence for me to see, both video and photos, and that was audio-visual evidence of the retrieved craft, some of the dead cadavers that were recovered, call it the pilots, as I said, in my interview with Nancy Mace. Photographs, video, of the bodies. He saw them. He's saying he saw them. And based on those images, based on the testimony of his sources, and based on his own extensive investigation, he said something else that's worth quoting with precision. Some of the recovered beings look exactly as consistently reported by credible witnesses over decades, consistent with the children at Ariel School, consistent with the work of John Mack's subjects, consistent with the physical descriptions that have recurred with a regularity that is either the most successful mass delusion in human history or evidence of something being accurately perceived and reported. The official explanation collapses here, because a mass delusion would not produce consistent anatomical descriptions across decades, continents, and cultures with no meaningful cross-contamination. Children in Zimbabwe in 1994 should not be drawing the same beings that alleged abductees in rural New Hampshire described in 1961, unless something is actually there to be described. There is also this from Grusch's testimony regarding the variety of craft and occupants recovered. You know, a whole taxonomy of different intelligences, from very familiar type of intelligence where they seem just a little more advanced than us, to indescribable non-corporeal type of sentience. A taxonomy. Multiple types, multiple origins possibly, some familiar in their biological architecture, recognizable as something like life as we understand it. Others so far outside that framework that Grusch reached for the word non-corporeal, without a body in any conventional sense. Intelligence expressed in a form that doesn't map onto our biology at all. What does that mean for the question of where the bodies are kept? If some of what's been recovered is non-corporeal, if some of it is something like the luminous orb phenomenon Grusch described, appearing at sensitive test ranges in ways that suggest intelligence and intentionality, then the question of physical storage becomes more complicated. You can't file a plasma entity in a filing cabinet. But the ones with bodies, the ones with what Grusch calls cadavers, those you can. And apparently, someone has. Here is where something specific in the Dr. Phil interview deserves extended focus, because it has significant implications for anyone trying to locate physical evidence. Grusch acknowledged that he knew, past tense, Quartimtage, where certain materials were being held. He specifically noted that his knowledge of locations was accurate up to the point in time when his source within a specific facility was still active there. After that, his location intelligence became stale, and here is why. There is a program protection strategy, unfortunately, to move movable archives and materials if they feel like the location has been burned or exposed. If the location has been burned or exposed, let me trace the implication. Grusch testified to Congress. He provided 11.5 hours of classified testimony to the Senate and House Intelligence Committees. He briefed the Inspector General of the intelligence community. He went public. His testimony was considered credible and urgent by the ICIG, the very standard that triggers mandatory referral to congressional oversight. All of this is on record. All of this is known to the people running the recovery programs. And if those people have a standard operating procedure to move materials when locations are believed to have been compromised, then Grusch's very act of coming forward, of forcing the issue into the institutional record, may have triggered the relocation of the precise materials he was trying to expose. The evidence suggests something larger at work here. A self-defending system, not conspiratorial in the Hollywood sense, not a cabal in a room making decisions, but something more distributed, more durable. A bureaucratic organism that has evolved over 8 or 9 decades to protect itself from exposure. Not through dramatic action, but through procedural adjustment, through the quiet movement of files, through the reclassification of programs, through the dispersal of materials across enough facilities, enough contractors, enough shell structures, that no single disclosure can locate all of it. Grusch offered something like hope when he described telling elements of the relevant task force that they would need to get eyes on those facilities. That a search and seizure operation, combined with witness depositions, could in principle locate and secure the materials before further dispersal occurred. "I know who to call and what doors to knock on," he said. I believe him. And that's precisely what makes the broader pattern so frustrating. The man with the map is sitting in the Rocky Mountains, hiking with his dog, waiting for a phone call that apparently hasn't come. If the government can't or won't secure these materials, won't audit the contractor facilities, won't force disclosure from private defense companies, then where does that leave us? Grusch raised a question that Dr. Phil asked directly. Have some of these materials been moved into the private aerospace industry specifically to keep them outside the reach of freedom of information laws? Certainly. Yeah, that's also keeping the funding outside of congressional oversight, Grusch answered. Think about that structural reality for a moment. A private company is not subject to FOIA. A private company's internal research programs are not automatically subject to congressional oversight. A private company's security clearance holders can operate under access protocols that exceed even the most classified government compartments, particularly in what are called unacknowledged special access programs, where the very existence of the program is itself classified. There is an entire architecture of private sector classified research that operates in the shadow of the defense and aerospace industry, legally, routinely, and almost entirely without public knowledge. It is not fringe territory, it is the normal operating reality of advanced defense contracting. Grusch referenced a specific historical example, a DIA program in the early 2000s that attempted to have Lockheed Martin transfer materials for outside the onion study, analysis conducted beyond even the normal classified program structure, but was reportedly blocked by CIA leadership. The attempt itself is noteworthy. What it implies is that even within the classified world, there are competing factions, competing interests, competing access structures. The left hand and the right hand are not coordinating, which means the materials could be sitting in a Lockheed facility, or a Raytheon facility, or a contractor whose name most Americans have never heard, and the government itself may not have a complete inventory. And here's the strangest part. Grusch suggested that some of the private holdings may not even have been government sanctioned in the original retrieval. That starting in the early 2000s, some contractors were conducting their own retrievals independently or quasi-independently, under the general cognizance of certain agencies but without formal program attribution. Off books, possibly not even fully reported up the chain. This is not the story of a single hidden warehouse. This is the story of a system so fragmented, so deliberately obfuscated, that even those running it may not have a complete picture of what exists and where. Across decades of whistleblower testimony, from the first tentative accounts in the late 1940s to Grusch's congressional testimony in 2023 and his interview yesterday, certain elements recur with a consistency that is difficult to dismiss. Small beings, grey or greyish skin, large craniums, large dark eyes, diminutive stature consistently reported in the range of 3 to 5 feet, no visible ears, minimal or absent mouth structure, recovered at or near crash sites, sometimes intact, sometimes not. The convergence of these descriptions across decades, cultures, and completely unrelated witness pools is itself a form of evidence. Not proof, evidence, something to be explained. And the official explanation, mass hysteria, cultural contamination from science fiction, misidentification of conventional phenomena, strains under the accumulated weight of testimony from radar operators, military personnel, aerospace engineers, and children who had never seen an episode of The Twilight Zone. Grusch's own description of the recovered cadavers was careful but consistent with this pattern. He explicitly referenced the aerial school children's accounts as corroborating physical description. He referenced John Mack's clinical findings. He spoke of the beings in a way that suggested familiarity, not the breathless amazement of a first-time listener, but the measured discomfort of someone who has processed this information over years and still finds it, as he put it, ontologically shocking. That phrase, ontologically shocking. He used it specifically in reference to discussing the pilots, as if the information is so fundamentally destabilizing to a normal human worldview that even someone who has lived with it for years feels the ground shift when they articulate it. What does it do to you to know something like that, to carry it, to watch the world go about its business in complete ignorance of a fact that, if true, reorders everything we think we understand about our place in the universe? That's not a rhetorical question. Grusch answered it in his way. There are certainly days that I regret even getting involved in the topic. My family's made a lot of sacrifices. Friends were harmed and co-workers. I live with that burden and a lot of mental, emotional and psychological scars. I keep coming back to a fundamental problem. Not the question of whether the bodies exist, Grusch's testimony, and the weight of corroborating accounts spanning 8 decades, pushes me well past agnosticism on that point. The question I keep returning to is different. What do we lose by not knowing? Because if there are cadavers in contractor facilities in the American West, if there are beings that were once alive, that were capable of interstellar or dimensional travel, that operated technology so advanced our best reverse engineering efforts over 7 decades have yielded only fragments. If there are beings that communicated telepathically, possibly through some mechanism we don't have language for, with the humans who found them, what did those beings know that we don't? What questions could we have asked that we didn't ask, because the people managing the program decided the rest of us weren't ready for the answers? Grusch raised the possibility that the recovered technology has civil applications, that there are developments, fruits of the reverse engineering labour that could help humanity energetically, medically, technologically, that have been sequestered in classified compartments, denied to the civilization that could most use them, because someone decided that the strategic advantage of exclusive possession outweighed the benefit of sharing. There's a lot of things that I see civil application and that could be responsibly introduced into society to help us and to also fuel different economies, he said, carefully, clearly aware of what he could and couldn't say. The deeper this goes, the more the withholding stops looking like a security decision and starts looking like something else, a choice made by a small group of people over generations to possess knowledge that belongs by any reasonable ethical framework to all of humanity. There is a cabinet somewhere, maybe out west as Grusch gestured, maybe in the sub-basement of a contractor facility with a name that means nothing and a purpose that's never been disclosed. Maybe it's been moved. Maybe the program protection strategy has already been activated and the materials are in transit to somewhere new, triggered by testimony that was supposed to expose them. The bodies, if they exist, have been dead for decades. Some of them, depending on when and where they were recovered, may have been dead for nearly 80 years. Preserved, catalogued, studied in secret by scientists whose names we'll likely never know, in programs that may not formally exist in any document that will ever be declassified. What did they look like in person? What could be learned from their biology that hasn't been learned or hasn't been shared? What do their craft's propulsion systems suggest about the nature of space, time, and energy that our physics doesn't account for? What were they doing here? Where did they come from? And what did the ones taken alive, the ones Grusch says were detained, communicated with? What did they say? Were they afraid? Were we to them what a laboratory animal is to a researcher? Were they explorers? Were they lost? Nobody who knows is telling us. The people who know are either bound by classification structures that carry criminal penalties for disclosure, or they've been systematically discredited through precisely the mechanisms Grusch described: attacks on mental health history, character assassination, the weaponization of personal struggles. Or they're dead. Or they've decided for reasons of their own to stay silent. Once you see the shape of the concealment, once you understand how it works, what it cost people to challenge it, and how thoroughly it has been maintained for going on 8 decades, you can't unsee it. The official story, the ball lightning and swamp gas and mass hysteria story, stops being a reasonable alternative explanation. It becomes what it always was, a policy decision dressed up as a scientific conclusion. David Grusch gave up his career, he gave up his promotion to lieutenant colonel, he gave up his proximity to retirement, he spent money on legal fees he's still trying to recover, his friends were targeted, his colleagues were threatened. The Air Force attempted to prosecute him under the Espionage Act. And after all of that, as of yesterday's interview, he was sitting in a podcast chair in front of Dr. Phil, describing cadavers in contractor facilities, and offering to take the President of the United States on a field trip out west to see them for himself. The invitation is standing, the bodies are waiting, and somewhere in the gap between those two facts, between the man with the map and the institution that could use it, the truth sits in a cabinet, in a facility with no name on the door, preserved and silent and almost certainly not alone. What happens when it finally isn't?